Six-Day War, Part 2, Operation Focus. In the previous part, we discussed how Jews and Arabs came to such life and why war became almost inevitable. I also mentioned a certain plan for a preemptive strike against the Arabs, which was being developed by cunning reptilians. Let's talk about this very plan. I'll just quote the then commander of the Israeli Air Force, General Modelichi Hod. We lived with the plan, we slept on the plan, we ate with the plan, we constantly improved the plan. By the way, cannabis is decriminalized in Israel now. Coincidence? I don't think so. In the late 1950s, the Jews began to develop their plan for a new war with the Arabs. I'll quote the former commander of the Israeli Air Force, Isaiah Weizmann. We had a plan for every case, even for capturing the North Pole. Plans are like bricks. You can use them only after another to build a structure depending on how events unfold. We didn't want to tie ourselves to a preliminary and therefore inflexible plan. The first problem facing the Israelis, not counting the progressing narcotic addiction, was the short flight time of the Egyptian jet aviation from the North Line airfields in Sinai to the main Israeli air bases, about 7 minutes. At the same time, the main forces of the Egyptian aviation were located at bases near Cairo, about 20 minutes away from the Jews to fly. That is, the following scenario was quite likely. The Egyptians make the first strike with small forces from frontline airfields on Israeli air bases and air defense assets, and then the main Egyptian forces finish off the surviving Israeli planes. The second problem was the significant numerical superiority of the Arabs in aviation, 3-1, taking into account the Iraqis. That is, almost impossible to destroy the Arab Air Force in aerial combat. The third problem was the presence of jet bombers among the Arabs. They could provoke a full-scale air battle over Israeli territory, a la the Battle of Britain. The Jews could not afford to let Arab bombers pass to the densely populated coast, and they would have to engage in aerial combat with the superior forces of the Arab Air Force. So, the Israeli General Staff came to the quite obvious conclusion that the first and most important task in organizing a preemptive strike against Arab countries would be to destroy their air forces in the first hours of the war. This operation was named Mokit, or Focus. Now it remained to figure out how to carry it out. In the Negev desert, a special test runway was built where the Jews practiced bombing and striking airfields. A special bomb for destroying concrete runways was invented. The Jews abandoned the idea of creating a separate bomber aviation and focused on multi-role fighter bombers, mainly French Mirages, Super Misters, and Mistresses. As the small country could not afford specialized equipment, Israeli intelligence focused on obtaining reliable and up-to-date information about Egyptian air forces and airfields. The next problem was the lack of precise information about the performance characteristics of the MiG-21 that the Soviets began supplying to the Arabs. At the time, this Dale machine caused considerable discomfort to the Americans in Vietnam. In a clash with an equal number of Phantoms, the outcome of the battle was unpredictable. Only in 1966 did the Americans lose 47 aircraft in aerial combat. The Jews were seriously concerned about the prospect of encountering the latest Soviet fighters. And as usual, they turned to the Mossad for help. There, the problem was taken seriously and a whole department was allocated to solve it. It was necessary to find an Egyptian pilot flying a MiG-21 who was dissatisfied with the regime. To do this, a radio interception team that recorded all conversations of Egyptian pilots and air traffic controllers was involved, along with a group of psychologists analyzing the obtained texts. In the end, in 1964, they found a disgruntled pilot and offered him $1 million and citizenship in exchange for hijacking a MiG. The guy agreed, and here it is, the morning of D-Day. The entire leadership of the Mossad and the Israel Air Force gathered at the airfield. And finally, a point is visible in the sky, without an inversion trail. The Egyptian pilot flew a training Yak-11 from 1945. But the Jews don't despair and allocate more money. The operation expands to all Arab countries, and in 1966, either the Jews were very lucky, official version, or systematic work yielded results. According to the official version, an Iraqi pilot from a Christian family either approaches the Jews through his entrepreneur uncle or is approached by a Jewish family servant. According to another version, an American beauty seduces the Iraqi pilot, takes him to a party in Paris, where he is then presented an offer he can't refuse. Most importantly, the Iraqi agrees to hijack a MiG-21 on the condition that the Jews evacuate his entire large family. The operation to evacuate the Iraqi pilot's family is perhaps the strangest thing Mossad has ever done. The entire family goes to a mountain resort in Iraqi Kurdistan. There, they go on a picnic and are kidnapped by Kurdish separatists from the PKK, almost with the personal participation of Barzani himself. What it cost the Jews and Americans, only God knows. Then the Kurds transfer them to Iran, on the condition that the Kurds are at war with them. And from there they fly by plane to Israel. And the icing on the cake is a conversation between the head of Mossad, Amit, and the CIA director Richard Helms, after which the US lifted the temporary moratorium on supplying weapons to Israel, and CIA personnel were examining the captured MiG the same evening. Alright, we've finished with the preparation, so let's move to the operation market. The Jews had about 200 modern aircraft, another 60 training combat aircraft, and 40 outdated piston engine machines. With these forces, they had to destroy 14 Egyptian airfields, where approximately 400 aircraft were located, and then have enough strength to deal with the Syrian, Jordanian, and Iraqi air forces, which together had about 200 aircraft. The Israelis decided to neutralize the numerical superiority of the enemy through accelerated preparation of aircraft for a reflight. If it took the Arabs about 2 hours for refueling and rearming, the Jews, working in the style of Formula One pit stops, managed to do it in 7.5 minutes. Pilots bombing distant bases in the Suez area followed the following schedule. Time for the flight to the target, 22.5 minutes. Stay over the target, 7.5 minutes. Return to the base, 20 minutes. Refueling inspection, 7.5 minutes. Total, 57.5 minutes. Such rapid preparation for a reflight allowed them to set up a full-fledged carousel over Egyptian airfields. The first wave that bombed Egyptian positions could return after an hour and strike again. Considering that the waves went at intervals of 20 minutes, there was almost always a pair of Israeli aircraft hanging over the Egyptian airfields. How did the Jews achieve such a result? How did they avoid serious losses from technical failures? How did the pilots not faint after making 5 or 7 sorties on the first day of the war? I don't know. Ask Allah, maybe He knows. So June the 5th, 1967 has come. At 7:45 Israeli time, the first Israeli aircraft struck Egyptian bases. Why at 7:45 and not at dawn or at least at 7:40? There are 4 reasons for choosing this time. The first, typically such strikes are carried out at dawn, and at that moment air defense forces and patrol fighters are in maximum combat readiness. Why weren't the Arab forces in heightened readiness 24/7 on the eve of the war? Well, it's the Arabs. The second, if the strike were at dawn, Israeli pilots would have to wake up around midnight. Indians to go to bed earlier than usual. Such a change in the daily routine would not go unnoticed, and there was a risk of information leakage. As it happened, pilots learned about the operation's target at 4 a.m. when they were awakened by the alarm. Pilots got enough sleep, and there was no leakage. The third, in the morning, fog hovers over the Nile, significantly hindering visibility. It dissipates closer to 8 a.m. The fourth, the Israelis knew the daily schedule at all Egyptian air bases. They also knew that a significant portion of the officers lived not in the barracks but in apartments within the city and would arrive for duty around 9 a.m. In Egypt, there is a different time zone, so at the moment of the first attack, it was 8:45 there, and a significant portion of the personnel had not yet reached the base. At 7, a flight of training aircraft took off, simulating routine patrols and conducting negotiations over an open channel. By 7:45, the Israelis launched their first strike on the main Egyptian airfields. Two pairs of aircraft attacked each of the airfields, with the primary task of destroying runways and Egyptian aircraft standing on taxiways. The Egyptian radars, whose locations were thoroughly known, were blinded by electronic wave means. In the front lines, airfields were attacked straightforwardly, directly across the border. Arabs couldn't react anyway, the flight time was less than 7 minutes. The planes attacking remote bases in the Suez Canal area and the Nile Valley flew over the Mediterranean and ultra-low. The planes attacking remote bases in the Suez Canal area and the Nile Valley flew over the Mediterranean at ultra-low 20 meters. Only around Alexandria did they turn towards the Egyptian air bases. The Egyptians couldn't detect low-flying targets in conditions of strong interference. So, in just 10 minutes, the Israelis put the main runways of the Egyptians out of action. They shot down 4 patrol fighters in the air and knocked out several more on the ground. Of course, with such small forces, from 4 to 6 aircraft per base in the first wave, it was impossible to completely disable Egypt's aviation. Somewhere, the runways weren't completely destroyed. Somewhere, intact fighters remained on taxiways. Of course, the fight strike was powerful, costing the Egyptians about 50 destroyed aircraft, but it was not deadly. If they had managed to get some more planes in the air, put air defense forces into combat readiness, prepare for the second wave of attackers, the war might have gone completely differently. But these are the Arabs. When the first wave of Israeli aviation was disabling runways, the second wave was already en route, and the third was taking off. These waves were separated by intervals of 10 or 20 minutes, depending on the distance to the airfield. The second wave also did not encounter significant resistance. According to various reports, 2 to 5 Egyptian aircraft managed to take off, and only the third wave, half of which consisted of training combat aircraft whose combat effectiveness raised certain doubts, faced substantial resistance, mostly from anti-aircraft guns rather than S-75 SAM batteries. The Egyptians had trouble with their missile systems in general until the 18th Special Anti-Aircraft Missile Division of the Soviet Army arrived in Egypt, and they struggled to establish effective air defense. The Egyptians hardly tried to get the surviving aircraft off the taxiways into the air, and the repair work on damaged runways did not start immediately. The funny thing is that the Israelis messed up the plan a bit, and they bombed 2 airfields ahead of schedule, and 2 particularly remote ones slightly later at 7:55. Do you think that Egyptian pilots intercepted them over these 2 airfields? By 9 a.m., the Egyptian Air Force was effectively defeated. More than 250 aircraft were lost, all bases were disabled, and most radars were destroyed. The losses for the Israelis were much more modest, from 10 to 15 aircraft. Alright, the Egyptian Air Force is out of the game, but there are still Syrians, Jordanians, and Iraqis, more than 200 modern aircraft combined, and you can't catch them all off guard. Oh, yes, they are Arabs. I almost forgot. Around 12 a.m., the news reached the Syrians and Jordanians that their ally was getting slaughtered. But they still didn't grasp the full scale of the chaos. Actually, even Nasser himself didn't fully understand what was happening. Syrian and Jordanian air forces struck nearby Israeli airfields with 20 aircraft combined. What the rest of the air forces were doing, hell knows. In my opinion, the conspiracy theory that the Arabs significantly overstated the size of their forces and were actively involved in embezzlement with Soviet generals might not be that crazy. The result of this strike was 1 destroyed Israeli transport aircraft. But Israel's hands were untied, and the next strike was delivered to Jordan and Syria. Only in the morning of the next day did the Iraqi Air Force enter the fray. What did they do? Right, they bombed civilian areas in Netanya. Maybe it was a cunning move by the Iraqis luring the Jews while preparing powerful air defense at their airfields? Nope, the Jews destroyed the main Iraqi air bases with minimal losses, and during the first 2 waves of attacks, not a single shot was recorded from the ground, and not a single standby aircraft was in the sky. By the morning of the second day of the war, the Israelis had destroyed 616 aircraft, and themselves lost 26. Almost all of Israel's losses were from 23mm anti-aircraft guns fire and due to technical malfunctions. Throughout the war, only 2 aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft missiles. It took the Egyptians 23 launches for this. To put it in perspective, in Vietnam at the same time it took from 2 to 3 missiles to down 1 aircraft. However, sometimes the Arabs woke up to the spirit of the old school, and they showed the Jews that they shouldn't be dismissed so easy. For example, an Iraqi Tu-16 pilot named Hussein Mohammed Husseini directed his burning plane straight at an Israeli military base. As a result of the explosion, 14 Israeli soldiers were killed, and 8 more were wounded. Effectively, this Iraqi pilot accounted for 2% of all Israeli losses in the war. Not bad at all. But still, this feat was more of an exception than the rule. Most Arab pilots literally scattered from the airfields after the first Israeli strikes, saw the disposition on the morning of the second day of the war. Arab air forces are destroyed. Arab radars are disabled and air defense is particularly blinded. Only small caliber anti-aircraft guns, shooting down a jet from which is a non-trivial task, can resist Israeli air forces. Arab radars are disabled and air defense is particularly blinded. Only small caliber anti-aircraft guns can resist Israeli air forces. Israeli air forces retained 90% of their combat potential and are ready to dominate in favorable conditions. Under such circumstances, any sensible leader would immediately run to complain to the United Nations and demand an immediate ceasefire. However, the Arabs had not yet fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Nasser was actually briefed that the Egyptian aviation bombed Tel Aviv at night and the Israeli air forces were destroyed. Even when the Arabs began to understand the scale of the defeat, they refused to admit that they had lost to Israel and instead blamed Americans and British for everything. So, on the second day of the war, Tuesday, June the 6th, a notable conversation took place between the President of Egypt and King of Jordan. I'll provide it in full as it is quite epic. Nasser, how are you? I want to ask my brother if the fighting continues along the entire front. Would Your Majesty like to make a statement about the involvement of Americans and the British? Hussein, unclear response. Nasser, hello, shall we mention the USA and England or only the USA? Hussein, the USA and England. Nasser, do the British have aircraft carriers? Hussein, unclear response. Nasser, okay, King Hussein will make a statement, and I will make a statement. We have put all our forces into battle, and on all fronts. We fought throughout the night. If we have any difficulties, it doesn't mean anything. We will win despite them. God is with us. Would Your Majesty like to make a statement about the involvement of Americans and the British? Hussein, unclear response. Nasser, by God, I say I will make a statement, and you will make a statement, and we will make sure that the Syrians make a statement about participating in the attack on us by American and British planes based on aircraft carriers. We will make a statement. We will pay attention to this. Everything will be in order. Hussein, okay, I agree. Nasser, 1,000 thanks. Don't lose heart. We're with you wholeheartedly. Our planes are flying over Israel today. Our planes are striking Israeli air bases from the morning. Needless to say, on Tuesday only Israeli planes were flying over the Middle East. Despite this, the Arabs refused to acknowledge defeat. So, ahead were 4 more days of war, and the Arabs had to endure the cup of humiliation to the bottom. Needless to say, on Tuesday only Israeli planes were flying over the Middle East. Despite this, the Arabs refused to acknowledge defeat. So ahead were 4 more days of war, and the Arabs had to endure the cup of humiliation to the bottom.